Experience Relativity.
Experience Relativity.
Experience Relativity.
Thank you for joining me on another episode of the Experience Relativity podcast. I'm your host, Shelton Smith, aka P. Winslow Lee. That's P. Dot Winslow underscore Lee on IG. And you can find the podcast at Experience underscore Relativity. I'm absolutely overjoyed to have you here again with me as we conclude the month of February, aka Black History Month. And we wrap up the theme for this month. The land of the free was simultaneously the home of the slave. This episode, we are focused on the dawn's early light, as the entire theme is a play on the national anthem. The dawn's early light is one of the significant lines in the anthem as well. But I want to take a moment to talk about Black History Month. Well, I want to take a moment to not talk about Black History Month the way that we've always talked about Black History Month, where we reflect upon all of the amazing accomplishments and the struggle that we have gone through. And that usually does a lot to highlight where we were at some point in time and how we've gotten to where we are. But the continuous question is, how far have we actually gotten? And, when I kind of take stock at all of that or with all of that, oftentimes it leads me to believe that we haven't necessarily come as far as I thought we have, or a lot of people think that we have. But one of the things that I do know for sure is that we haven't gotten any closer. And that's the reason why I say we need to stop talking about Black History Month the way that we talk about it, because we do reflect a lot on the past. But I think ultimately, the goal of celebrating Black History Month is to celebrate the actions that were taken that ultimately brought us closer together. So I want to make sure that we take time to focus on that. And of course, that's the objective of Experience Relativity, is to explore the space between us, not just to highlight the space between us, but to bring us closer together. So I would definitely ask the question of you listening, what's different for you now that we've celebrated another Black History Month together, that we've reflected on the past together, and we've highlighted the Grand Canyon that was between us at some point in time? I would ask, now that we've celebrated another Black History Month, what is different now? So, without further ado, jumping into the episode, you already know what time it is. It's story time. This is one of my favorite segments of the podcast because we get to kind of just explore a story, and it may not always be my story. It may be the story of others, and that is the case today. So I want you to go on this journey with me of thought in this story. The the exploration is really of something that I think is really relevant for this period of time. Fast forward to 2025, and you can't put down your phone. Uh, Without technology, you pretty much can't connect with anything as we think, and everything in life revolves around technology. I remember being in corporate America, and they said often that every company is a technology company. So the corporate world revolves around this, and your personal life for most of us revolves around technology. But what if we woke up one day and said, "Nah, I'm gonna skip it today." And in fact, I'm gonna skip it every day for the rest of my life. I'm gonna go without the internet and technology for the rest of my life. I don't really think it's serving me well, and I really want to reconnect outside of technology. I had this thought, and of course, I jumped online, ironically, to explore it. And I came across an article by someone named Mark Boyle. The name of the article was My Advice After a Year Without Tech: Rewild Yourself. I was like, man, that's a interesting title. I think I get the gist of it without even reading it, but I dove in. And one of the big things that I took away from this article, and I kind of thought about it myself because I do believe I held the same kind of thought process around it. A lot of us think that life without technology is actually the simple life. And I think at first sight, it does appear to be a simpler life. But you'd have to ask yourself the question, what's the purpose of technology? And in its simplest answer, technology is here to simplify life. It's kind of the reason why we all love it, is because ultimately, everything that technology does, for the most part, simplifies something that we used to do in a more complex way. So, the author of this article really was exploring, is it really the simpler life? And is a simpler life actually better for us? He talked a lot about seeking challenges. He actually wanted to have to do the difficult thing instead of pretty much having everything laid out for us to where, again, all information is available to us at, the unlocking of our phone and the opening of a web browser. If you want a meal, you can DoorDash or Uber or have it bought to you. Pretty much everything is kind of broken down to simplify everything for us. And where does that ultimately lead us was kind of the quest that he went on. But in thinking about this story of life without the internet, again, thinking it's a simple life, how hard would it be for you? And I think that immediately erases the idea that it's a simpler life, because how hard would it be for you to decide that you're going to go without technology? I don't think there's anything simple about that nowadays. But another good question, which probably adds to your individual challenge of doing this, is how hard would it be for the people around you to accept that you have decided to go without technology? Technology's an integral part of pretty much everybody's life. I mean, no matter how hard you try to avoid technology, technology is somewhere in the chain of everything that you do, save going out and living in the village and all this other type stuff. But it doesn't mean that everything else around you is not being impacted by technology. So I don't even know if you could isolate yourself 100% from technology without again having to embark on a much more difficult life than the one that you had with the technology. The people around you would still be on the technology. And it's funny, I said on the technology as if it's a drug or something. But the people around you would still be on the technology, and they just would not be able to understand. I mean, I went without a cell phone for like 8 months many, 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 many years ago. And like my father was so troubled by the fact that he could not just pick up the phone and reach me whenever he wanted to. And I think, yeah, at the time when I did that, I didn't have any kids. So I did not fully understand, and I hadn't experienced relativity yet till I had my own kids. And now, having a 13-year-old son who's had a cell phone for quite a while because he's a type 1 diabetic and goes into the whole ecosystem of how he takes care of himself. I would freak out now if my son didn't have a cell phone. So now I realize why my dad was so troubled by the fact that I didn't have a cell phone and he couldn't pretty much reach me whenever he wanted to. But that's just one example of how so many people around you would just not be able to accept that you decided to go without technology because it's such an integral part of their lives. It's an everyday thing. It's just odd, at this point for someone not to be engaging with technology fairly frequently every single moment of their lives. Now, let's say you make this decision because you believe that it's better for you, and that's what the author, did, or at least he embarked on the experiment for that reason. But there's something that comes with that. Like when you decide to do something different than everyone else, and then you believe that it is bringing you some positive results. I mean, it seems like the only thing you could do is keep it to yourself, because the moment you start to share that you are doing something that not everyone else is doing, and then you start to praise the results that you're getting as you continue on that path, you kind of start to exude this somewhat righteousness in your choice, about your choice. And as if the fact that you were living without technology wasn't enough, now you have to deal with the fact that people kind of perceive you as being a little righteous about what you're doing. And after that whole righteousness thing kind of kicks in, and that becomes the lens that people see you through, the thing about righteousness is that it starts to inherently make people question whether there's something wrong with them because they haven't made that choice. And that kind of leads to a place of resentment for them. And that part adds another layer of complexity onto your whole experience of life without technology. And it seemed like a great idea at first, but next thing you know, you're on the outside looking in. Everyone thinks that you're crazy because you're doing something that no one else is doing, and that is essentially like breathing these days. And now they resent you, and you kind of become the enemy of the group of people who are not using technology, which would be pretty much everybody that you're surrounded by. And when everyone else would get to the point where they see the benefit in what you were doing, if it's beneficial, you were just the one who saw it first and had to kind of go through that process. The process of being seen as righteous, and the process of being resented by everyone, and then being lauded as the pioneer of this process. So from here, I want to get into the first slant. And for those who are not familiar with this, it requires one, two, let me put it, sorry, I almost put it out of the camera, but two slants in order to make an X, and there's always a crux to those slants. Slant one, as we've explored during Black History Month, the experience of both the non enslaved Americans and the enslaved Americans during the period in which Americans were enslaved. The title of this episode is Dawn's Early Light, and I want to talk about the early lights. And when I say early lights, I'm specifically talking about the people who had the light bulb moment that, hey, enslaving people is probably not a good idea. Those people who, when everybody else was doing something every single day, and it was just as common to see it as it was for human beings to breathe, you had a thought. There's something I don't think is quite right about this. And I think that we should try to do something differently than we've always done it. So I like dates and I like being able to understand timelines. So let's go back to the beginning. The first enslaved Americans or Africans that were brought to America occurred in 1619. Now, as I was doing a little bit of research for this episode and preparing, I came to understand that the first history that was allowed to remain history of any type of opposition or resistance to slavery appears in the history books in 1688. So just think about that. If the first enslaved Africans showed up in America in 1619, that's 79 years that went by before at least what was allowed to remain in history shows us that someone was in opposition to this and began to make some noise about this. Now, 79 years passed, but it also took another 177 years before slavery was abolished. What the hell took so long? I don't, I mean, I get it, and we'll actually talk about it in just a second, but I get what made it take so long, but it still doesn't make any sense. So, when I talk about 1688, I'm talking about the Quakers, who were really the first prominent group that was allowed to exist in history and remain documented that were opposed to the enslaving of other human beings. Now, of course, there's other history that is not necessarily allowed to be documented to this day. So a lot of it shows up as kind of speculative history. So, I won't really get into that, but I will get into the 5 reasons why the early lights were shaded, why they were kind of snuffed out. One, our economic dependence on slavery. Two, the slow moral awakening, which is very different than what we see these days thanks to technology. Because of technology, everybody has a platform. You have the ability to create a free account and you can broadcast just like I'm doing right now. So, if you wanted to get the word out and give people the ammunition that they need or put the alarm clock out there for the moral awakening to happen, you could show people, with the snap of your camera. But they didn't have that back then, of course. So, it took a long time for moral awakenings to kind of build up steam because you actually had to convince people without them being able to see it. But that's also the power of storytelling and hopefully why you will experience relativity. Limited platforms is reason number 3. Who's going to give you the platform? If the nation is accelerating at a rapid pace and profitability is up tremendously, who's going to open their doors for you to get on their platform and start talking about how we need to reevaluate our morals? 4, the racial justification in laws. So then there came the not just the profitability of what was happening, but then it became, oh, this is just morally justified because, this group is less than us because of their race. And then it was codified in laws. So now you can't even resist it because it's been written into law. And last but not least, and the logical one, for the slave owner, is of course they're going to be in opposition. if I went and bought a car and then my car was deemed, this actually happened to me now that I think about it. I bought a Volkswagen TDI and then my car was found to have illegally passed emissions tests. So you went and bought a car and now your car is deemed to be terrible for the environment, and people wanted to take your car away. You know, you would not be happy about that, just like a slave owner would not be happy about the idea that they have to give away something that they quote unquote, spent their hard earned money on. It's a human being. But yeah, so you can kind of to some degree understand that the slaveholders were not going to be thrilled about this. And this was the wall that was built around slavery that dragged out a process that, at least for those living with today's morals, would say it was a no brainer, that it was something that we should have abolished or done differently. So, another word for a wall of defense is a rampart. And slant two of this episode, I want to talk about looking or the rampart, another part of the national anthem. So, slant two, of course, jumps into the shoes of the enslaved American. And in the national anthem, it says, or the rampart we watch. So, this is the wall of defense that was placed around slavery as an institution. And behind that wall were people of African descent who had been brought here and enslaved. So you ask the question, like, okay, you got the Quakers who are doing their work on the other side as the first group, or one of the earliest recorded groups in history, doing this work to abolish slavery. But what were the slaves doing? What was their experience? What were the enslaved people's experience while all of this was going on? Well, first and foremost, I need you to know that there were people of African descent that were not enslaved, which, okay, maybe everybody knows this. I'm not saying it's new news to me, but I don't think I've really got the concept. You keep hearing stories about people who were free, but I think until you understand the length of time that slavery went on, there were still people who were purchasing their freedom. And there were many ways that people of African descent were being made free over the process of the hundreds of years of the institution of slavery. So, one, you had indentured servitude. So you had some people of African descent who were coming here and actually coming with an agreement that they would work for a period of time and then be made free. Once they were free, they would get out, work, save money, own property, start businesses. They did a lot as free black people. In fact, there were wealthy, free black people in the dead center of slavery. Now you got to ask yourself the question, if the overwhelming majority of people of African descent in America were enslaved, then how could a black person become wealthy in America? And they couldn't do it without doing business with people who were not of African descent. So the free black people were doing business with unenslaved people. They were doing business with white people and becoming wealthy from it. So if we going all the way back to this idea, which again, one of the things that fortified the institution of slavery is the idea that there was some racial inferiority, but you had wealthy black people doing business with everyday white people and wealthy white people. So I'm going to channel someone I aspire to have as a mentor, John, I'm talking to you, John Hope Bryant, he talks about how slavery and the position that African Americans have kind of been in this country has a lot more to do with money than it has to do with the color of our skin. And I think going all the way back to this example, which I had a specific example, but we don't really have to go into it. But if you have an opportunity, look up James Fortin. As a person who, if you've checked out the logo for the podcast, it incorporates a nautical compass. I'm a sailor at my core, and eventually I will circumnavigate. But John Fortin was he was a sailmaker, and his father was a sailmaker. And I believe it was either his father or his grandfather who had purchased his freedom, and that is the reason why James Fortin was free. As the story goes, he worked on a massive project and raised the sales for this project and did some inventions and ultimately became a very well known sailmaker in Philadelphia. The thing that smacked me in my face as I was reading is I believe it was 1813. He was one of the wealthiest people in Philadelphia, black or white, not one of the wealthiest black people. He was one of the wealthiest people in Philadelphia, period. That's what I mean when I say, though it may not be news that there were free black people, just the magnitude of how they moved and were able to build wealth, that comes from something that John Hope Bryant was talking about just recently, which is yes, DEI is in crisis, but he would encourage people to stop really engaging in this whole DEI discussion and engage in the DIY discussion, and that's the do it yourself discussion. And when we look back to these people who were able to build wealth in a period of time where most of the people that look like them were enslaved and do business with wealthy white folks at that time, that was a do it yourself mentality. And they weren't going to allow themselves to be put in that place, no matter who said it was, who said they were, no matter what a law said they were. If they were born free, they remained free, so they stayed free. But one of the things I want to highlight about the idea that what was going on with James Fortin and other, you know, free people of African descent in America, and it being less about their skin color and more about business, these people did not look beyond the business deal. The business deal of slavery put certain people in a category that made them be treated a certain way. And the rest of the people who weren't in the mix of that whole deal, who may not have been slave owners, all they did was not look beyond the business transaction. They accepted the business transaction as gospel and they acted according to it. When I thought about this, it made me think about how oftentimes we don't look beyond the business transaction either, because we get things and then of course you must accept terms and conditions in order to use that thing. And if you looked at the terms and conditions of most of the things that you agree to, you probably wouldn't be happy with it, and you probably would understand that it puts you in a predicament and not on the good side of that predicament. So I just wanted to highlight that even at this point in time, we are still not looking beyond the business deal. Simply because if there is something that we want, we're going to look at whether we're getting what we want or not, and we're not looking at all the other underlying elements to it. So it's just who we are. So when we turn around and look at slant one from slant two's perspective, again, you can kind of understand one where they were coming from, and it doesn't necessarily, it doesn't justify the length of time it took from the early light to the full blown awakening in the sunrise. It doesn't justify that. But at the same time, from the other side, when looking at slant two, there is always, a a need to push and understand what's going on because they weren't most of the people who were behind the rampart looking over. They weren't just sitting there. They were all doing things all actively at one time, but at the same time they needed something. So I have another quick little story time that I want to share with you guys, and it's from a personal experience. And that personal experience is kind of a funny experience now when I think about it as an adult, but it wasn't as funny when I was a kid. So most of the households that I knew, they had either a punishment system where you would get quote unquote like grounded or something like that, or basically you got your butt whipped. And maybe you were out of commission for that day, but then the next day was a new day and you got to start over again. My household believed in a double dose. So not only did you get your behind whipped, uh, you also were on punishment indefinitely. So I guess as long as someone was still pissed off about what you did to get on punishment, you were on punishment. So I can remember being on punishment, and what that looked like in my house was, you would go to school, you come home, you do your chores, and then you go sit in your room. And you would just sit there until dinner's served. And then after dinner, you might go sit in your room for a little while longer until you went through your nighttime routine and went to bed. So I can remember sitting by the door in my room because if you sit by the door, you could hear the TV. So I used to listen to the TV while I was on punishment. And the funny thing I remember we didn't have a light in every room in the house because the bedrooms didn't have TVs or anything like that. Um, so you just didn't need a light in the room. You went in the room and went to bed. And if you were sitting in the room, I think we even moved lights from one room to the other, depending on if you were sitting in the room. And sometimes, again, if you're on punishment, you might not get a light in the room. You were sitting in the room and you were sitting by the door and you were just kind of listening to everybody exist and live their punishment free life. So when people would walk in the door, like let's say somebody, family, aunt, uncle, I live next door to my grandmother, so people would come over all the time, every single day for family, and you're on punishment and you're sitting in the doorway. I remember wishing that someone who came in would help, would be like, oh, let that boy out of the room. Like, let him watch TV, let him do something. You would just want someone to help so bad and just kind of break you out of that punishment. When I thought about this as I was going through this topic, that's what I thought about. I thought about the early lights being on one side of the wall, and I thought about, enslaved people kind of like me as a kid sitting by the doorway, hearing discussion. Sometimes they would talk about me being on punishment and sitting by the door in a dark room, trying to listen to the TV to keep myself entertained. And like I would hear that and I would just be wishing that in that moment, somebody would do something and they would just set me free from the punishment that I was stuck in. So when I thought about this, I imagined that's what the enslaved folks may have felt like during the time when the early lights were just kind of having their light bulb moment and seeing that this is probably not the way that we want to move forward. So now we're at the crux. The crux of the episode is you had the early lights that were working, and you had the people who were on the other side of the wall that were working, the enslaved folks. It made me think about how we applied this in general to where we are today. And when I say where we are today, I mean all people. Uh, we are all working towards something. One. Every single one of us is working towards something. Every single one of us needs support. Every single one of us. Anybody who comes with that BS talking about they did it all themselves, you can work very hard yourself. And I take nothing away from people who work hard. I'm in the middle of that. But at the end of the day, no matter how hard you work, you are still going to need the support of others. I want to take a quick minute to talk about the difference between help and support. Help, by my own definition, is, kind of being in need. Like, needing help doesn't require you to be doing anything yourself. Support, on the other hand, requires you to have some motion yourself that people can get behind. Getting help, in my opinion, is more difficult than getting support, because getting support means to me that you have to show them that you are doing something to quote unquote like help yourself, and they can just get behind that and get you what you need to be able to accelerate how you are helping yourself. But either way, at some point in time, you may need help. At some point in time, you may just need support. But either way, we will all have to ask for it. And from my own experience as a human being, we all seem to hate to ask for help or support, even though we all know that we all need it. Even the wealthiest people in the world have to ask for support. And I'll use somebody like Jeff Bezos as an example. And I'm not even talking about the high level support of I want to build a rocket ship and go to space. So I need billions of dollars from the government, and I need all of my wealthy friends to help support Amazon from the beginning to make sure that it cannot fail. Not that type of help. What I'm saying is that somebody like Jeff Bezos, in order to be where he is, needs he needs to ask for so much help that he built an entire piece of technology that does nothing but say, hey, you bought this. I need your help in staying as rich as I can possibly be. Would you like to buy this also from me? That's what Amazon is. And that the game changer for Amazon was recommendations. It knows you so well from your purchases that it constantly asks you to purchase other things that are adjacent to what you purchase. That, my friends, is asking for help or support. So while we had the early lights and while we had those looking over the rampart, both needed help. If they didn't, one, it wouldn't have required 79 years for us to get to the point where there's recorded history of a massive enough opposition to slavery. And if there wasn't more help and support needed, it wouldn't have took another 177 years for us to eventually abolish it. So, knowing that we need help and support, I want to say thank you. Thank you for each and every person that listened, that has watched, that has shared, that has signed up for the email list. We do this here at Experience Relativity to spark your curiosity about the experience of others. We do this to support the exploration of the wildest place on the planet Earth, and that is the space between us. So thank you for exploring the space between us with Experience Relativity. Make sure you tune in next week because the theme for March is Get Wilder. And Wilder is an acronym for What I Learned Doing Endurance Running. I'm getting ready to run a marathon on the 16th of March, so you'll get a couple of episodes prior to the marathon, and you'll get an episode from the marathon, and you'll get an episode after the marathon. But what I want to talk about is how the experience of training for a marathon and ultimately completing a marathon and then ultimately recovering from a marathon, how it changed my life. And just the preparation alone has done so much for me. I'm still working behind the scenes on the website. So, for all of those who are signed up for the mail list, again, thank you. And that's the best way to find out as soon as the hoodies and merchandise are available. I'm really excited about these hoodies. Oh my gosh, because every single person who has seen these hoodies in person and touched them and got a chance to feel the quality and the weight of the hoodies has asked to purchase one. So they're being sold even before I have an opportunity to create the store. So for those who have signed up for the mail list, you will be the first to know when they're available and you can get your hands on those. They are coming for sure. Uh, if you have not signed up, just hit the experiencerelativity.com and you'll be able to sign up for the email list and find out when the hoodies are available and once the store is up and running. As always, your presence is met with gratitude. I appreciate it so much. Thank you for exploring the space between us with Experience Relativity. Love you.
Experience Relativity.
Experience Relativity.
Experience Relativity.